there has never, ever been a program that was found to be 100% successful for all kids in all situations.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I'm your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. Joe Lockavitch is enthusiastic about helping kids read. That enthusiasm is contagious. So much so that our conversation on learning spans 2 episodes. This is part 1. Joe has been in the field of education for over 30 years, and during that time, he has held multiple roles, including teacher, school psychologist, and special education director. Most recently, he has turned his attention towards reading because, in his words, quote, "We are underestimating the reading potential of chronically failing students," end quote. As you will hear, however, Joe's insights on students extend well beyond reading. This podcast is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
I'm a former classroom teacher, university professor, school psychologist, special education director. My company itself has been in existence now getting close to 35 years, but primarily I'm an educator on a mission. And the mission has been that no matter where I was, no matter who what setting, I would always come into contact with students that defied conventional instruction as we know it, and as one teacher said, can't read a lick. And so that basically started me on a quest, and that quest is all things being equal, why?
Right.
And I have not stopped that quest. I continue to grow in it, but I think I found some things that are very, very exciting. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to have 9 published studies in national and international journals. So, one of the things is Will Rogers once said he never met a man he didn't like. But he also had a phrase that was even better, Brad, and that is, it ain't bragging if you done it. It ain't bragging if you done it. So
Right.
what I found is that the enemy is not the student, it's not the parent, it's not the teacher, it's not the administrator. That the real enemy is essentially the instructional approach and the unique needs and characteristics of this population. And when you match the approach and the materials with the needs of your clients, all of a sudden things happen that almost border on miraculous. It's kind of exciting. I share you this, that when I first started, my wife and I decided I was a special ed director, and I had just done a period of time with as a university professor, but I knew I wanted to do something more. And so I said, well, I'd like to start my own company because I really believe that that I've created a curricular solution that has impact. And she said, well, let's try it. I'm not going to leave you, and let's see if we can make this happen. And that's what we've been doing ever since.
I have a lot of questions for you, obviously, because
Great.
there's a couple things in what you say. First of all, listeners of Talking About Kids will recognize because they've heard it before that education is not a one size fits all. But then you also just talked about a curriculum. So to me, a curriculum, it starts to make me feel nervous because a curriculum sounds like one program for all students. I know that's not necessarily what you're advocating for. So I want to hear more about
No,
that.
that's yeah, and I'm glad you asked me that. No,
Yeah,
I'm not. I'm not advocating a one size fits
right,
all. In fact, as I always tell people, if we were to take the 12 leading reading researchers in the world, put
right.
them in one room, um, had an armed guard with a single exit, and told them that they couldn't come out until they had a universal definition of what reading is
Mhm.
and how it should be taught, Brad, they would starve to death before they ever came out the door.
The
So
one
if
thing they might agree on, Dr. Joe, real quick, is they probably would all agree that how it's being taught in 90% of classrooms is wrong. Though they might agree with that, right? Uh,
I'm not sure about that
okay.
anymore.
Oh, wow.
Here's what I found. I found that if there is a universal,
Mhm.
that one reading research fact that you can take to the bank, and that picks up on what you said, it would be that all reading programs have value, but they
Mhm.
don't work for all kids.
Okay.
And so that goes back to the notion that there has never ever been um, a program that was found to be 100% successful for all kids in
Right.
all
Right.
situations. So what you have to do is you have to, and it makes sense. And the reason why it makes sense is you've got to look at the principle of neurodiversity.
Yes.
If we were all born in the same and acted the same way and had the same learning styles and had the same strengths and weaknesses, then it's a mute point. We don't have to worry about anything. But that ain't true.
Right.
So the reality is that what my research has found is that you can go one of two ways. 99% of the interventions that are out there are primarily based on what I call the RD concept.
Okay.
And my 0.001% is based on the CS concept. Now I hope I've intrigued you with that.
Yes.
RD versus CS.
So
Well, RD,
what is RD?
go on.
Yes, please.
That's a great question, Brad. RD stands for the remediation of the deficit.
Okay.
The remediation of the deficit. The assumption is that there's something wrong within the learner. And not only is there something wrong within the learner that prevents them from being successful, but that whatever that something is, it has to be remediated in order for them to go forward. Now, the next question would be, what is CS?
And what is CS, Dr. Joe?
That's another great question that you've just asked, Brad. I knew we were going to hit it off. CF CS stands for capitalize on the strength.
Nice.
Capitalize on the strength. My philosophy is I really don't want to hear any more about kids who
Right.
have problems. I would rather spend more time talking about kids who are being successful because we're stressing solutions that
Mhm.
that focus on their strength as opposed to their supposed weaknesses. And when you do that, good things happen. How am I doing so far?
You've already got me hooked. This is all stuff that, again, listeners will have heard me on Soapbox about these different things. So that's great. I do want to back up just for a minute because
Sure.
oftentimes, the teachers in the school districts with which I work, they are. We keep giving them more to do, or at least it
Yes.
seems like we do. And I am keenly aware that they're facing a lot of new pressures that they weren't necessarily facing when they started off as teachers. And so anytime that I try to introduce something new to them, especially if it sounds like it's going to be a new way of doing something and it might take additional effort that they might not have, I want them to hear about some of the additional benefits of it. And one of the things that you point out in your research and your materials is that there are additional consequences to the reading deficit beyond just that reading comprehension score. And you talk about that reading deficit may manifest in behavior problems. Can you
Oh,
explain that a little
absolutely.
bit?
Absolutely. In fact, I what I talk about a lot, Brad, is everybody talks about the three good R's in education.
Right.
Reading, writing, arithmetic.
Exactly.
But what they forget are the three bad R's in
Hmm.
education, and that is retention, referral, and rejection.
Yeah.
And one of the problems that I see so far is that we are always blaming the victim, and the kid's the victim.
Right.
The I remember I started again saying that all that we're underestimating the ability level of chronically struggling kids.
Right.
Change the approach and you will change the performance outcomes. If you don't change the approach and if you just do same old, you're going to get um, some really sad consequences. In fact, when I created this intervention, this solution, the materials, whatever, I really did it to be a reading attitude adjustment program because these kids, Brad, are their own worst enemies. All right, we talk a lot about we
Right.
talk a lot about motivation, and one of the things that you'll see continually is chronically struggling kids are poorly motivated. You'll see
Mm.
issues that in many ways uh, they're not excited about what they're doing. They don't
Right.
look forward to it. Well, my belief is that just the opposite is true. That when you look at the kids that we're talking about, for the most part, they don't carry less motivation. In many ways, they carry significantly more motivation. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
I have 5 children, and all of them went to Title I schools. All of them did very very well. Different learning styles, but
Mm.
they all did very well. I'd walk into the building and people would say, Dr. Joe, I love Tess, or I love Frank, and I love this, and I love that. And I'm saying, yeah, well, you should see him at home. But we won't go down that path. But in that same breath, our kids, and my question to you is, um, how much motivation does it take Tess and Frank and Jessica and Alec and Rachel to go to school every day, knowing that when they get in there, they're going to be told how wonderful they are and,
Yeah.
and how they struck.
Right.
Now let's go back and let's go back to the kid that he's going in there and it ain't working right,
Right.
and every day he or she fails. Well, eventually one or two things are going to occur. I call it what I call is Lockavitch's law, and I hope you don't mind if I get just a tad off color
Yeah.
if
Please.
that's right. Well, it's if you're sitting in a classroom, um, 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 35 weeks a year, feeling like an ass.
Yeah.
There's going to eventually become a day when you start acting like that.
Yeah.
And the reason why is that a lot of these kids have learned that it's a heck of a lot easier to be thrown out of class and go one on one with the AP, the assistant principal, than it is to make a fool out of themselves in front of their peers. Now, here's one more thing. The ones who are overly assertive, frankly, they function a little bit better than the other ones.
Mm.
The other ones are the ones that come to school every day. They sit there, they're quiet, they're not disruptive,
Yeah.
they're moved along. And I'll give you an example of one that I wrote about in my book, Failure Free Methodology, New Hope for Non-Readers. Yeah. And I was running a summer clinic for graduate students. And it was a reading clinic. And there was one boy that came in every day. I think he was 7 years old. And Brad, he came in every day religiously with the baseball cap on his head. Never took the cap off. And I thought, well, why is he taking? Why is he
Right.
not? Why is he so wrapped up in this hat? And why isn't he taking off his head? So I wanted to do a little bit of research into background. This is what I found. I found that the young boy was there because he was 7 years old. He had already been retained in kindergarten.
Mm.
He was a virtual non-reader in first grade, and if we didn't help him, he was going to be retained again. So why do you think, given that, why do you think he wore that hat?
Well, I'm guessing that there's probably a couple reasons. One is it helps him hide a little bit inside that classroom. And I also suspect that there is something about that cap that makes him feel good, that it's some sort of
And both
transitional object, right?
and both of those are spot on. But there was also one more reason, and
Yeah.
it get back and it goes back to your first one. He was hiding, not his eyes,
Right.
not hiding in the class. He was physically hiding a condition from the group. And you
Wow.
know what that condition was?
I
His hair was falling out in clumps. He had a condition known as localized balding. Want to know what causes it?
I'm guessing it has a little bit to do with stress and anxiety, Dr. Joe, but what
Stress and anxiety.
uh,
Say, that's what people don't
yeah,
realize, okay?
yeah,
These kids, you've got a lot of kids. Now, we're doing a project in North Carolina. The state legislature in North Carolina has funded a pilot for me to work with sixth, seventh, and eighth grade
right,
students. And the reason why I wanted that target population is it's so difficult to work with, but more importantly, they bring to them a certain learning conditions. Number one, a lot of these kids are in many ways their own worst critics.
right.
Many of them have failed so much and so far that they've just given up, and they're just looking for 16 years old to finish the process. And so, if you're going to work with this population, there are certain things you have to do. You have to make sure that you are instilling dignity, pride, and self-respect.
Okay.
So the last thing that they need are elementary solutions for an adolescent,
Right.
the infamous dancing bears and bunny rabbits. That's the last thing that they need on the screen. And so, one of the things that my research has found is that when you control for certain conditions within the textbook and the way in which material is presented, that all of a sudden you will see kids working at significantly higher levels. And because they're working at higher levels, they're feeling more positive
Right.
about themselves. Let me give you an example. I again, we go back to Will Rogers, and it ain't bragging if you've done it.
Right.
So when I first started my quest, I would call schools and I would say I'd like to come out and do a live demonstration, but I'll only do it under two conditions. So I know you're being as astute as you are. I know you're going to ask, Joe, what are the
Dr. Joe, what are the two conditions that you would do the live demonstration?
I'm telling you, I am just amazed at your skill as an interviewer. Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Brad. Number one, I said I would only work with the kid that they were most concerned about, or
Mm.
the worst kid in the building, and I didn't
Yeah.
don't in a pejorative way. And then ask the second condition.
And the second condition was
If they didn't see a dramatic change in
right.
comprehension and confidence within a 30-minute period, I'll walk out the door and they'll never hear from me again.
Right.
Now that's a hell of a statement.
Yeah.
And I've done this across the country 1,000 times, from maximum security to rural settings to inner city. 6666. It
Right.
doesn't make any difference. Incarcerated youth. So I'd sit there with the student, and I'll give you a case in point. New York City. South Bronx. The assistant superintendent said, I heard about your claim. And he
Hmm.
said, I'm the assistant superintendent of special education for the Bronx, and I want you to come up and do that live demonstration. I said, oh, well, I'll be up there. So I come up there and they bring me a ninth grader. And the ninth grader had been in special ed now for 3 years.
Okay.
He came in sixth grade as a virtual non-reader.
Wow.
3 years later, after intensive treatments, guess what?
Still a
He was
virtual.
still a virtual non-reader.
Right.
So now I'm sitting up there with him and the assistant superintendent and his team, and I show them the passage that I'm about to teach using the methodology, the
Okay.
approach, the curriculum material. And the first thing I ask him is I let him know that he's not there because he's in trouble. He's there because I wanted somebody's opinion as to whether or not they felt that this was good, that you would recommend that he would recommend that I use it with other kids similar to him.
Okay.
So I put the passage down in
I like
front
that.
of I put the passage down in front of him, and I had copies to the superintendent, the assistant superintendent, and his team, and they're looking at it,
Right.
and this I see over and over and over: the underestimating of the ability level of kids.
Right.
Okay, they're looking at it, and if looks could tell a story, and they saw that passage, essentially what they said was, our assistant superintendent has invited a madman here, and we're going to have to get this man out of here because there is no way under the face of this planet
Right.
that this kid is going to be successful with the content in this material. So I sit there with the passage and I say to the young man, too easy, too hard, just right.
Right.
He looks at it, too hard. I can't do this. Okay. All right. Do you know this word, this word, this word, this word, this word, which were all key words that were built into the passage?
Right.
To which he says, no, 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 and no.
Okay.
Uh-huh. So we start the methodology. We start the approach. Well, the methodology is to me, reading is gaining meaning from the printed page. Reading is more than simply recognizing words.
Right.
And, and everything that I do is based on the notion of comprehension.
Okay.
If meaning is not occurring, then comprehension is not
Right.
occurring, and so I'm everything that I do is based on a 3-word philosophy, a lot of 3 words,
Mhm.
and the 3 word in this one is reading is relating.
Okay.
You cannot read for meaning something you can't relate to.
Right.
The more you know about a topic prior to reading it, the better it would be. But what we have to do is we have to make sure that there's a good match between what we put in front of them and what they bring to the task. That's
Right.
another thing. Input precedes output. The more you get into the system, the more they'll be able to express it later on down the road. But in this particular case, I go to the first word and I said, "Do you know what this word is?" And he says, tries to sound it out, and he says, com, a company. And I said, yeah.
Yeah.
And I said, a company.
Right.
And I said, what does that mean? And he said, I don't know.
Right.
To which I said, well, how'd you get here? Oh, Mrs. So and so took me. She brought me in my class, and she
Right.
brought me. Oh, so she was with you, yeah. So she accompanied you as you came down here,
Right.
yeah. So if someone accompanies you, or accompany means to be with someone. I said, well, now let me ask you something. Um, do you have many friends? And he said, yeah, I've got a few. Well, let me show you this word. And he tries to sound it out, and it's aqua. I said, well, the word is acquaintance.
Okay.
And do you know what acquaintance means? No. Well, that's just a fancy name for a friend.
Right.
Oh. Um, so I now asked this question. I said, well, let me ask you something. Do you know this word? And he says, atornoi. I said, no. I said, um, when somebody gets in trouble with the law,
Right.
what do they need? First thing out of his mouth, a lawyer.
Right.
I said, well, this word is attorney. And do you know what attorney means? He said, no. I said, that's just a fancy name for a. Now, 30 minutes later, he's reading the following as I'm reading. The attorney and her acquaintance were astounded at the abundant size of the rock singer's house. The house was large enough to accommodate over 100 people at a time.
Right.
And we talked about all of the different words that were in there. And I added more. There was more to the
Right.
passage. You see where I'm coming
Right.
from. All of a sudden, a light comes on in his eye. I said, too easy, too hard, just right. Brad, he looks at me and he says, too easy. I said, now, wait a minute. Who
Right.
just took this passage
Right.
from too hard to too easy in under 30 minutes? He says, I did.
Uh,
I said, that's right, you did. I said, how's it feel? He says, terrific.
right.
Feels great. Now, here's where it gets sad, Brad. And I've seen it all the time. But
Right.
this classic example, I said, what grade are you in? And he said, ninth.
Right.
Wonderful. I said, what grade level do you think this passage is? First thing out of his mouth, fifth. So now I say to him, no,
Right.
try again.
Right.
You know what he says this time?
No,
Fourth. Try again. Third. I said,
oh,
oh, let's stop. I
yeah.
said, let's try it again, only this time, let's go to the other word.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I say, he says sixth, and you see a little
Yeah.
change in his posture and his jaws. I said, no, higher.
Right.
Seventh? No, higher. Eighth? No. I said, what grade are you in? Ninth? Well, how's it feel to read a ninth grade passage? And the kid that left was not the kid that came
Right.
in. That's what I mean by impacting.
Right.
So when you set the conditions, all of a sudden you see kids who didn't think they could, and at much higher levels. I'll take a breath and how am I doing so far?
You're doing great. You've pushed several of my buttons. In the example that you gave, one of the things that I'm struggling with is, I mean, in your example, this is a kid who was getting special education, and so he'd already been
Yes,
identified, and he'd been
yes.
failing at that for a while. So that one-on-one
Behavioral,
instruction. Oh
emotional, and
yes,
learning disability.
exactly. That approach, when you've got one or two teachers in a classroom of 30, how do you do what you just described for that group of 30 when you've got one or two teachers?
That was the biggest problem I had for the first 20 years of my life,
Yeah.
of my career.
That was part one of my interview with Joe Lockavitch. For more information about Joe and the Failure Free Reading Program, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. From there, you also can find out about upcoming episodes, suggest a topic, learn more about me and my books, or submit your questions for future guests. Our theme song is by The Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.